So Susan Farren is a published author. She's a speaker, a humorist, and a mother of five. After a 31-year career as a paramedic, consultant, and educator, Susan was diagnosed with what initially was thought to be terminal cancer. She survived that diagnosis and used that experience as inspiration to piece together the research for how stress and trauma affects first responders. She then used the sale of her home in late 2017 for the seed money that founded First Responders Resiliency, Inc. FRRI is a certified 501c3 dedicated to training active and retired first responders, as well as their families, in evidence-based proactive approach to mitigating symptoms of post-traumatic stress. So with that, please join me in welcoming Susan Farren to our Golden Gate Breakfast Club.
Thank you, everyone. Anastasia, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I am really grateful for this opportunity to come and speak to all of you, and so sorry that I was listening in and the passing of Sid. What a wonderful, as I love the phrases, gentleman and the legacy that he left and that smile. And so I love the other comments too about the idea that let's make sure to tell people that we love them when we have the chance. And then let's also try to be a legacy and a joy to the lives of the people around us. So with that said, I want to just go ahead. I just showed you this opening slide. This is our organization, but I'm going to hide that slide because I don't think anyone likes to look at a slide for half an hour. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our work, and I'm going to open up the gallery so I can see the faces of all the people that I'm talking to. Hi, and tell you a little bit about our work. Anastasia gave you kind of a recap on what we do, but I would like to tell you a little bit about me and why this organization exists, and also to inspire you if you feel compelled to do something in your life, regardless of what that is. No is not an answer. And so I believe that with all of my heart. First of all, let me say that I never in my wildest imagination thought I would be the age that I am. So Anastasia just kind of put the cat out of the bag, said we've known each other for 20 years, which makes it really hard to believe that I'm only 25. But I suppose most of you will go along with that. And so I would like to share with you that this industry that I have worked for my entire life is the reason why I started this organization. As Anastasia mentioned, my background is as a paramedic. As a matter of fact, I have been working on the ambulances since I was 18 years old. So that is a long time. That's nearly just over 30 years for me of working on the ambulances. I worked actually here in Sonoma County. I am your little sister here in Sonoma County, born in Marin and raised in the town of Sonoma. And then I actually worked here in Santa Rosa as an EMT on the ambulances for a couple of years. Not my plan. My plan was to go to law school and to be an attorney, but somehow I got scallywagged into working as an EMT, which I thought would be a temporary job. And then I went off to one of Stanford's last paramedic programs when I was 21 years old and started as a paramedic in West Oakland in the mid 1980s when crack cocaine had arrived. Now, I will tell you the story, if you don't know this, about this industry. When I arrived in Oakland, the crack cocaine, as I mentioned, had just hit the streets, and penetrating trauma was a huge problem. So let me use a quick example that I use here. In Sonoma County, I ran one shooting in 2.5 years with a guy who stuck a small handgun into his waistband in a bar and shot himself in the thigh. And when I arrived in Oakland, my first 24-hour shift, I'd run 3 fatal shootings. So a very different dynamic. I would spend almost 5 years working in Oakland. I would spend the first 2.5 years working as a paramedic, running an average of 16 to 21 calls every 24 hours and working an average of 72 hours a week. And then after just over 2 years, they promoted me to supervisor. And so now I'm in a paramedic truck, and I'm not just going to my calls in the ambulance, I'm going to all the calls in my district. So I'm now assisting the other paramedics on mass casualty events, multiple vehicle car crashes, drive-by shootings. So that's what I did for the first 5 years of my career as a paramedic. Now, I'd had some history and background in my own life. I'd lost my mom when I was 17, and my dad had left when I was 15. So I was really kind of an independent kid, really trying to learn how to work my job as a very young woman out there in Oakland. But I got what we called in the day as burnout. See, the Vietnam vets had post-traumatic stress, but the first responders had burnout. And none of us put together that we were not being exposed to war like the vets were, but we were being exposed to our own type of a war. War, for many reasons, obviously, has exposure to trauma and high stress. Well, we're doing that over long windows of time. So the same symptoms we're seeing in vets when they come back after 2 tours at war, you will see similar symptoms in a first responder. Sometimes when they've been on the job 2 years, sometimes when they've been on the job 25 years. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to let you know that what I'm talking about today is the human condition. Every one of you can be dealing with some of these symptoms. As you know, this is the home of the Tubbs fire for us. I have lived here my whole life, and I was evacuated 5 times in 3 years. So this is inconceivable to be living in an environment where you're evacuated from your home for 11 days. It's very difficult to absorb that kind of trauma. And we all have trauma. Just losing Sydney is a trauma. I could hear some of you choking up as you talked about him. And I just say trauma, which is you're having a normal response to sort of an abnormal situation. It's not abnormal for people to pass, but it's never a comfortable position for us to lose someone we're attached to. So you're going to have a response to that. And I would invite you to consider giving yourself permission to grieve those losses. Even if you say to yourself, gosh, I wasn't that close. It doesn't matter. When the emotion, which stands for energy and motion, starts to arrive, do yourselves and all of us as first responders know, don't suppress that. That is what gets first responders in trouble. So let me tell you a little bit about while I'm working in Oakland, I get burned out. And guess what I do? I do what a lot of paramedics and first responders do. I change locations. And guess where I came? I went to San Francisco. I worked as a paramedic for the Department of Public Health right before it merged with the fire department. And I was working the mean streets of San Francisco, which I will tell you was actually a little bit of a break compared to Oakland. Oakland was, for me, a whole lot more intense. I actually didn't like the fact that we drove these great big box ambulances in San Francisco on these little tiny roads. And we lost a lot of our side view mirrors, and you all got a lot of stripes down the sides of your cars from the ambulances trying to navigate through while people were double parking and stopping and halfway on the sidewalk. It's, you can imagine it's a pretty chaotic environment trying to manage those kinds of vehicles in that town with those roads. So anyway, I got to spend some time in the city. And then I would eventually get invited into being an instructor. I have sort of a gift for gab. I'm very firm about the medicine, but I'm fair about it. And I've got a bit of a sense of humor. So I was a good fit to work in the fire departments and the ambulance companies as what was called a clinical manager. So I would provide oversight to the firefighters and paramedics and make sure they were doing a good job. Lots of times people would have questions about why so many people show up at my house. I called an ambulance for medical care and 4 firefighters came in. So I would have to answer those kinds of questions about most people don't know when you're a civilian, although I was engaging in chat with someone this morning who's got a son who's a firefighter and a son who's a military person. And thank you very much for supporting their service. But oftentimes civilians don't really understand the dynamics of what's taking place in this industry. So I would do a lot of training and education around that. I would meet and marry my husband, who was also, as Anastasia said, a paramedic firefighter up here in the North Bay. We would be married 23 years and have 5 children. What? We have 4 boys and a little girl. Girl graduated from Berkeley just a couple of years ago, has started her own wildfire mitigation company, and 4 sons living in Southern California in the film industry. So that was craziness, and that's what 2 first responders can create. But that's not really what this story is about. My story is not really about me working as a paramedic and all the things I could tell you. I could invite you to consider not to say to a first responder ever, what's the worst thing you've ever seen? Don't invite them to relive that memory. Don't say things like, how do you do that for a living? I could never do that for a living. Because you just unconsciously, no intention to be in any way disrespectful, it sets them up to believe that they always need to be different and they always need to be on the job, right? So what happens for me is I'm in this industry and I will find out, much to my dismay, that that husband that I adored has a girlfriend. Now, this is not, I want to say, uncommon in this industry because people are attracted to people in uniform. And I would end up going through in 2014, begin the process of going through a very unwanted divorce. And I am now a single mother with 5 kids. My now ex-husband has moved on with his life with somebody who does not have children and has, it appears to be all the lives, all the things that are going to be easier. And I actually was familiar with this. I knew that there was a very high incidence of divorce in first responders. I'd seen it. I'd worked in the firehouses. I actually was working as a consultant to the fire departments. So I worked for Novato Fire, Sonoma Fire, Petaluma Fire, and I did, as I mentioned, their quality assurance over medical care. And I had seen so many of them come in and get newly married or be happily married, and within 4 or 5 years, going through a divorce and changing partners. And I thought, wow, this is really unusual. I saw lots of things happening in the industry that I grew up in. I witnessed that there was a huge problem with alcoholism and addiction, although we're very good at keeping that under wraps. There was a huge problem with depression and isolation, oftentimes, especially with law enforcement, not wanting to go into restaurants or sitting in a restaurant with their back to the wall and facing the door, not being comfortable at social events, avoiding things like barbecues, because this is what I would understand as I began to do the research. First responders are never off duty. They tell themselves they take off their uniforms, they leave their weapon in the duty locker, or they take all their equipment, they leave it at the firehouse, and they tell themselves, I'm not going to take my work home. I'm not going to share it with my spouse. And they tell themselves they're off duty. And I'm going to tell you firsthand, nobody in this industry is ever off duty. The moment we see somebody collapse, the moment we see a vehicle begin to have a problem on the freeway, we're back on duty and we're there to help. And so oftentimes what I want to talk about with first responders is how it's affecting their nervous system. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So as I mentioned, in 2014, I began going through an unwanted divorce. And in 2015, I went back to Oakland to get a full-time job with benefits because my benefits were through the firehouse. And my husband and I were going through a divorce. I was not going to have medical benefits. So in 2015, I arrived back in Oakland. I went to work for the county agency. I was going to be in charge of training and education. I was there about 5 months through the beginning of 2016 when I began to urinate frank red blood. Now that discovered that I had a tumor in my right kidney. Initially, that discovery was met with, don't worry, we see these all the time. We'll take it out laparoscopically. We'll have you back to work in 2 weeks. But when they brought me in to do scans and they put me through an MRI and put dye in my body, they discovered a mass in my liver and discovered that I was going to have to go to San Francisco, resect my liver, take out my kidney, and start me on palliative care. Now, my children at that point are 14, 16, 18, 20, and 21. And they're in the same age range I was when I lost my parents. And I had made a commitment to myself that I would not leave my children without a mother, especially since we were also 2 weeks from that diagnosis. I was 2 weeks away from my divorce being final. So in March 26th of 2016, I'm diagnosed with what is thought to be terminal kidney cancer. April 8th of 2016, the divorce that I do not want is finalized. And April 26th of 2016, I'm in for major surgery to remove my kidney. But here's the thing, 36 hours roughly after my diagnosis of terminal kidney cancer, they actually discovered that I have a birthmark on my liver, not a cancer mass. And apparently it's not completely uncommon to redheads, go redheads, and it's a hemangioma. So it's like a port wine stain you might see on someone's face. I have one on my liver. So on that early scan, it looked like a cancer mass. But they went ahead, they did not take me to San Francisco. They went ahead and kept me in Santa Rosa, and they went ahead and opened me up under my right rib cage. They removed that tumor and part of my kidney, and they checked the rest of my belly for any hidden cancer, just to make sure. Unbeknownst to me, they would actually paralyze my belly in that surgery. They would cut a nerve bundle, and the lower quadrant of the right side of my belly is paralyzed, so I can't sit for extended periods of time, which means if I want to fly to London, I do have to fly first class. Terribly sorry about that, but I can't sit up for that long of a flight. So anyway, I ended up having this paralyzed belly. I would not know that for 6 weeks. Remember, I work in Oakland. I'm driving here from Sonoma County to Oakland, but I won't know for 6 weeks when I try to get back in my vehicle and drive to Oakland that I can't sit, because the whole time I'm recovering from my surgery for those first 6 weeks, anytime I'm uncomfortable, I just recline or lay down. I have no idea that belly's paralyzed, but that's not even the part of the story that is the linchpin for my company. 3 days post-surgery, one of the surgeons comes into my room and he just makes this simple comment. We see a lot of this in first responders. And I said, you see a lot of what? And he said, organ cancer. Now, I had never heard anything of organ cancer in first responders. I knew about our depression rates. I knew about our substance abuse issues. I knew about our divorce rates. I knew that 6 of my partners in 20 years had taken their own lives. And I will tell you, I always thought, oh my gosh, they must have terrible home lives. It never dawned on me that it was related to the work that we were doing. I'd lost several of my partners to cancer, but we all thought it was related to the toxins that they were exposed to. But when he said this comment about we see a lot of organ cancer in first responders, that triggered something in me. So when I got home from the hospital, the first thing I did before I got in my bed is I was using a walker, still not knowing my belly's paralyzed. I'm just very weak. And I get over to my computer and I enter organ cancer first responders. And I find a medical article. And every day I will go to my computer and I will look up another article on first responders. I wasn't looking to do anything with this. Remember, I'm a recently divorced mother who is now not aware that she's about to be medically removed from my career and not knowing it. And I'm a single mother of 5 kids. And I'm just going to try to figure out how to survive and get to the retirement that I've worked so hard to get, including my husband's retirement. We're supposed to be in an RV traveling around the US, spending our children's inheritance, but that is not what's going to happen. My whole life has changed as a result of a couple of decisions that have been made. And so when I start doing this work, every day I find another article. I find an article on organ cancer in first responders. That leads to an article about heart attacks in first responders, strokes in first responders. Then I'm looking at divorce rates and substance abuse and all of the things that are affecting first responders. And one of the things I think about while I'm doing this research, remember, this is just for me. As I'm doing this research, all I can think of is what's happening that we have all this information we can find about why the first responders are dying, but nothing's being done in advance of the first responders dying. So if you know veterans, you know what I'm talking about. What we do is we don't train people in advance of something as traumatic as what they do for a living. This is not information that's taught in the academies, and there's very little money being used for what's called behavioral wellness now. But what we do is we provide services after people begin to exhibit signs of post-traumatic stress. The 3 things that we've been offered in our industry is the EAP, the Employee Assistance Program. And if you're a therapist, no disrespect intended, but when you're a first responder coming off a fatal car crash, when you're trying to reach a therapist, you need that person now. You don't need them 3 weeks from Wednesday. And it's very difficult to talk to someone who has zero idea other than a textbook or a TV what you do for a living. So what happens is it's difficult and people don't access those resources. Then they came up with something called a debriefing. A debriefing is when we get all together and we talk about what we just saw, this horrible call, and we talk about it from one person's perspective and the dispatcher's perspective and the police officer's perspective. And it's meant to make us feel like we're part of a tribe and we're not alone in our pain. The problem is nobody thought about something called mirror neurons. The simple fact that when you retell a story like that, other people's mirror neurons fire to make it relatable, and they're re-triggered by their own trauma. And the other thing that we've created in the last 15 years is something called peer counseling. And this is where one first responder can talk to another first responder who has experience on the job. But again, we're re-triggering each other. And although it feels good to have the comfort of knowing someone understands you, it does nothing to get your nervous system back in line. So as I began to do this research, and some of you are old enough to remember Close Encounters of a Third Kind, where they had this, they kept hearing the music and they build a mashed potato mound in their living room. And that's kind of what happened to me. I began to feel overwhelmed by this desire to figure out what was happening to first responders. And I covered my family room wall, much to my children's dismay, in butcher paper. And I started with the neuroanatomy. The first thing I discovered was that the human brain changes as a result of exposure to trauma and stress. The limbic system, the amygdala, they're all altered by the exposure. The amygdala becomes hyperactivated. The limbic system begins to diminish in activity. And all of this begins to affect their psychology, the way they think about the world. When their psychology is impacted, their emotions are also impacted. Emotions stands for energy and motion. And what we do is we recognize, and you all know this, when you get a firefighter or a paramedic or a police officer showing up at a call that you're on, you don't want to see us cry. You don't want us to be emotional. We have to suppress that emotion to do our job, and we're good at that. So we do that, but remember that 45 minutes after we take care of your loved one, we're on another call, and then we're on another call, and then we're on another call. And each of those people want us to keep our emotions in check. That's not a bad thing on the civilians. It's just a simple fact that we are suppressing our work in order to do the job next. And then what happens is we can't turn it back on when we get home. So our emotions are impacted. That affects our relationship. We're often struggling with using things like alcohol and medication to try to sleep and forget about the memories. That leads to substance abuse. You add a little sleep deprivation into the mix, which most of us don't sleep through the night because we have this retriggering of our sympathetic nervous system, and you have a recipe for suicide. I saw that. I put that together on my living room wall, and I thought, oh my God, why doesn't somebody do something? Why has no one ever done anything? And I thought, I could do something. I'm a first responder. I understand. I've spent the last year doing this research. I know what's going on. Maybe I could do something, because everyone said, oh, it'll take 10 years for the academia to change. It'll take 10 years for it to end up in the academies. But it doesn't take 10 years when you've got passion, a family room covered in butcher paper, a paralyzed belly, and a desire to change the world. And so, as Anastasia mentioned, 3 weeks before the Tubbs fire, I sold my house with the permission of my children for the seed money to start a company to change the world for first responders. I did not want to travel all over the country teaching first responders. I actually wanted to build something called a Resiliency Center. I wanted a place for first responders to go if ever they began to struggle. I love the fact that the veterans have these access resources for them. There are millions of dollars coming out of the federal government and retreats for them now, but there's never been anything for the first responders, just the first responders. And the beast is a tiny bit different between the veterans and the first responders. So I always wanted to build a resiliency center. But I thought, no one's going to be able to go to a center if they don't know about the work that I do. So in June of 2018, I hosted my first conference with 40 first responders, thinking it would be like a Flex hair commercial. If I could tell, they could tell two friends, and so on, and we'd get the word out. And in June of 2022, we have trained 6,000 first responders and their family members. I have traveled to Hawaii, to Canada, South Dakota, Pennsylvania, signed a 3-year contract with CAL FIRE, just did the first pilot program for an insurance company in the state of California, and now we're in conversation to help the US Marshals and the Capitol Police. Never in my wildest imagination did I think a retired paramedic, mother of 5, who would go through a divorce. So I always say this: if God had come to me 10 years ago and said, hey, I've got a great idea. We're going to start a resiliency program for first responders, and it's going to go all over the world. Are you willing? I'd have said, absolutely. But if I had known it was going to come at the cost of a house, a husband, and half a kidney, I'd have said, I'll pass on that decision. Now, I will tell you, as that dream was always to build a resiliency center, and I've got about 3 minutes left here, and I want to open this up for questions, that I kept telling people, I want to build this center, I want to build this center. And a year and a half ago, without any real funding, but we're teaching all over the country, I stumbled into a coffee shop and found a real estate magazine, and there was a piece of property in Cotati, California, 18 acres, used to be a little 9-hole golf course, had a parking lot for 100 cars, a clubhouse that could be a classroom or an office, and a little house at the top of the hill. And I came and looked at it. I told the realtor I didn't have any money, but I was really excited about the idea of building a center for first responders and their families so they could get the real-time access to the help that they needed. Trauma therapists there 7 days a week. Everything that we do is holistic. We do everything from mindfulness and meditation to cold plunge to sauna work to toxin release. We do everything we can to keep their bodies and their minds happy and whole and keep their families together. And 3 weeks after I saw this property, the realtor called me and said, the owner would like to talk to you, the owner of that land. Well, it turns out the owner had donated to my organization 6 months earlier. She knew who I was. I was a paramedic with my hair on fire from Sonoma, California, trying to change the world for first responders. And she said, we have 7 offers on that property, 2 of them over asking cash offers, and my husband and I are physically sick. We do not believe it's morally or spiritually right for us to sell this land to anyone but you. And they made a donation to my organization. They gave me the seed money to be able to put down on a loan. They helped me facilitate the loan. They've never given me any money personally. They've given me an opportunity. And so just over, gosh, I want to say 18 months, but it's been, I think, 16 months. I ended up on 18 acres in Cotati, California, where I'm sitting right now. And we were in the process. We've had renderings done by an architect out of San Francisco called Studio Bana. And we're working with people locally. We're trying to raise the money to build the first responder resiliency center in the world. So when you say that it can't be done, or, you know, a recently disabled paramedic from Roanoke Park, California, couldn't change the world, I say I doubt that's true, because what I have is a heart full of passion. I'm not a businesswoman, but every day I'm learning. But I am, in my own way, doing everything I can, not to, well, first of all, I don't want post-traumatic stress to be called a disorder. And Tim and I wrote a little bit about that this morning. Number one, I'm going to offer this and then I'll be done. Post-traumatic stress is not a disorder. It's an injury. Schizophrenia is a disorder. You're born with it and you have it for life. But post-traumatic stress is an injury. You're not born with it. It comes as a result of cumulative or acute exposure to stress. So we want this changed. Number one, we don't want that title anymore. And number two, we don't want any first responder to get it. We're going to teach them. We just got back last night from Encinitas. We were down there training them, giving them the tools that they need to proactively prepare for the trauma and stress with tools that they can use to mitigate the symptoms and not take it home to their families. As I say, post-traumatic stress is not a disorder, it's an injury, and no first responder has to get it. And if you do actually start to get the symptoms because you've been too traumatically exposed, we'll give you the skills to deal with it, mitigate it, and recover from it. So that's my story. Thank you for giving me the time to tell you my story.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate you being here today and sharing your story as a former first responder. I was actually, my first part-time job when I was 15 years old was working on the back of an ambulance. At 15 years old, I can still remember some of the calls that I went on very vividly from this, from that time. That was before the paramedic program, and that's how I lost my job. They started wanting people that knew what the hell they were doing in the back of ambulances. Though I was trained in first aid, I was not a paramedic, and I wasn't old enough to be one at that time, so I lost my job. But I also later became a law enforcement officer, a deputy sheriff, and saw many things there as well. Lost 2 colleagues who were shot in the line of duty, and one on the DUI task force who got hit by a drunk driver on the side of the road, and his car blew up and caught fire, and he burned to death. So anyway, I appreciate what you're doing, and want to thank you personally for that. And we will open it for questions. I saw Colin Hussey's got a question, and Ricky Wilson, and then Patricia.
Yeah, I think one of those questions was already answered, the link to your site, because my brother has worked as an EMT for quite a while, and he's presently up in Oregon. And I have to wonder, some of the stuff he might have experienced over the years has led him to recently, or I don't know if he's now gotten himself a home, or but he'd been living out of his car for a while and having difficulty, getting work. And he's about a couple of years younger than me. And but yeah, he's one of those guys where when he's talking about his work as an EMT, his serotonin levels shoot up. He's intelligent. He becomes more intelligent. It's just, yeah, it's part of who he is. And I think he might have finally got himself a job as a medical consultant, because he has a very good encyclopedic knowledge of. He's one of those he's a savant when it comes to emergency medical.
Yeah, the trauma that happens to first responders is invisible. So I like to use this phrase, you cannot see the label from inside the jar. So when it's happening to you, you're unaware that it's happening. And oftentimes it's the families who begin to notice the change in the person. And that's the work that we do, is we help them sort of re-establish this whole problem with their neural pathways. And that's a big part of what happens, which is exactly why Tony just made a comment about the calls he can remember when he was 15. The more emotional an event, the deeper the neural pathway, which is why everyone knows where they were on September 11th, 2001, but you have no idea what you had lunch for last Tuesday. Those neural pathways are grooved in there. So he can be absolute, like you said, and a savant when it comes to medicine, but emotionally and physiologically, he can still be suffering.
Susan, thank you for a thought-provoking presentation. I totally agree with you that the word disorder should be dropped from post-traumatic stress. And the person that started me thinking about that some years ago was General Mike Myatt, who was a long-time member of this club and the man who liberated Kuwait City in Desert Storm in 4 days. I was a proud member of the Cape Valley Volunteer Fire Department for 17 years. I coordinated swiftwater rescues on a Class 3 river for 15 years, and I was at least a dozen years as president of the Firemen's Association. And I found that humor, and you mentioned humor as a part of your arsenal, was a great healer in terms of when we were all back trying to make sense of the disaster we just dealt with. Would you talk a little bit more about, I hesitate to call it gallows humor, but on some levels it might be, but how do you see humor factoring in as something to diffuse the stress that fire people have gone through?
Thank you. That is a phenomenal question, and I can answer that easily. Humor is what we use because it's the only safe emotion that we're allowed to have if it's not anger. And so what I find is that people are accessible to humor as a source of release, which was what we do. The problem is we use humor or anger exclusively as an emotional outlet. And then what we can't do is we can't tap into vulnerability and sensitivity and compassion. So this makes us really good at what we do and really funny in the firehouse, but we end up divorced because we can't connect emotionally, because that humor is often, as you use the word, gallows or sarcastic. And that humor actually sets you apart from the people around you who are not on the job. So what we encourage first responders, part of the work that we do, is we invite them to try other feelings. We introduce them to what emotions would be normal. I actually show photos of faces of people having different emotions. And then I show pictures of Steven Seagal, and all of the emotions, it's the same face. Right? Because that's what we do in this industry. And so we invite first responders. I always use that word. I'm inviting you to consider trying a different emotion on. And then we introduce them. And so what we do is we host 8-hour trainings as our intro. We do 16-hour trainings for people who want more. We do 3-day seminars. And our last conference of the year is actually being held this year up in Bishop's Ranch in Healdsburg. And we'll bring in 40 first responders and train them in this work.
Thank you, Susan. And didn't Steven Seagal turn out to be a jewel?
Oh, yeah. Sydney should have put him in a ring. Anybody else?
Yeah, Susan, I have a question. And before I begin, we did have a little bit of a back conversation. I would like to explain to people why we don't want to call it PTSD anymore. And that is, and it goes state by state, but because it's California, because it's most prominent in California, you need to be aware of this. If a person is diagnosed with what is now called PTSD, it's not considered an injury in the judicial system. If there is a divorce due to PTSD, and that's a very, very common issue, the spouse with the disease is banned from all contact with their children. Now, if you want to send somebody down the road of suicide, just to take a mother with PTS, which is a very common occurrence in the military, and deny her access to her children due to a divorce laws in California. So I have a son with 70% disability and a son-in-law that is an EMT. I just can't imagine either one of them lasting a week if they lost access to their children. And luckily, we don't have that law here in California. Susan, my question is, are you familiar with accelerated resolution therapy, ART? Because I just had a friend experience a very traumatic event and went through ART, and in one session has mitigated the effects of the traumatic situation. And he will be speaking here at the GGBC in a couple of weeks.
Wow. I'm not sure if ART is part of the EMDR process, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, but
Yep.
that sounds like it's probably exactly in correlation with that. And yes, we use it and we support it.
It is closely related to EMDR. And I think anybody with anyone in PTS situation needs to look into EMDR and now ART. And only 20% of the victims of PTS are veterans.
Right.
You went through it with the divorce, et cetera, et cetera.
And
I'll
the
turn it, go ahead.
The interesting thing is to note that post-traumatic stress is now a presumptive disability in the first responder industry in the state of California, and it's no easier to prove than a back injury. And so we know that a lot of people who end up out of work because of this, they don't want to be out of work. They really don't want to be off the line. They love what they do for a living, but it's no different than tearing your ACL. It's a brain injury. It's a result of an exposure, and there are things you can do to turn that around. But a good point from you, Tim, is exactly that. Remember, everything we're being offered right now is post-injury. Our program is proactive. We're trying to get ahead of it so we can train the first responders how to stay alive and not get that diagnosis or have to go through those experiences. Not that they won't be necessary. Therapy will always be necessary and debriefings, but let's give them some tools before they walk in the door.
Thank you for your work, Susan. It's remarkable.
My honor. My honor.
I have a question. Susan, thank you so much for your excellent presentation and about your life. It's very moving and all of the wonderful work you've done. I'm a little confused with, and I've been a nurse in the past and a family nurse practitioner and dealt with death and trauma as well, but totally different in hospital situations. So I have had some experience. My question is, you say that you shouldn't relive it and talk about the terrible experience. But then I think on the other hand, and I'm not a therapist, if you don't talk about something, are you repressing it? And then it just eats at you in a different way. And I'm sure you're coming up with tools, or there are tools with which to handle this, but not, I don't know.
That's a great question. It's a valid question. And so let me clarify. I wasn't suggesting that they don't talk about it with a therapist. What I was saying is it's never a good idea for civilians to say, what's the worst thing you've ever seen? Number one. And number two, that the only thing that we've offered them is talk to each other about it. I'm not suggesting that that isn't something we should be doing. I think it is something we absolutely have to be doing, but we also have to have tools in advance of that to keep us alive and well, and to recognize that when I'm talking to another first responder about a difficult call that I've run, I'm going to have a chemical cascade. Adrenaline and cortisol is going to run through my system. Bessel van der Kolk, the body keeps the score. Memories are not stored in the human brain. They're stored throughout the tissues. after I've had that peer exposure, just like you and I were talking about, if you and I were to talk about the work that we do, after you and I talk, I would have you do some discharge techniques, get some of that energy and memory out of your tissues, have you do some tactical breathing, get some of that, get your pH aligned a little bit better, and become aware that it may trigger memories, and then to immediately start to have control over those again. So we just give them tools that when you do talk, you don't just talk and then relive, you talk and discharge. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that. And in some ways, I think we all have a little bit of PST because of COVID in very,
100%.
very different degrees, and we don't get it. We don't understand
Yeah,
that.
we've lost friends, we've lost parents, we've had financial issues. Those
Mhm.
things all trigger that trauma, and then the brain begins to loop that trauma, and then we begin to have anxiety around it, and then we feel like we've lost control of our brains. And this is what I say. We spend millions of dollars on apparatus and equipment and supplies for first responders, and we spend almost nothing on the most important piece of equipment they will ever have in their lives, their brains and spinal cords. And that's the work we do. I also want to mention that we work with Loma Linda University, who's doing an empirical research program on us, a professor at UCLA, and most recently a neuroscientist out of Vancouver, Canada. So all the smart people, they're getting on board with all this passionate paramedic conversation, because apparently the earliest empirical data says that we're having a transformative effect in the lives of the first responders and their families, because not only are we sort of subject matter experts, but we're all people from the streets. And so our presentations are always laced with humor and experience.
Thank you. Thank you. Great job.
Well, may I say, Susan, thank you for a great presentation. Thank you for being such a good role model. Thank you for reminding us there are angels in the world, as in the wonderful people who sold you the property because you were the right next owner, not the most profitable offer. On a day we celebrate our angel that is Sydney, that was an added bonus to your story. Good luck with all your work. And my question is, knowing all this, does this information and affect the recruiting of first responders at a time in history where we need them more than ever?
Yes, and that's a great question. And by the way, I could listen to you talk all day. So if you could just send me a recording of you reading the phone book. Oh, we don't have those anymore. But yes, to answer your question, absolutely. What we're trying to do is get them informed early in. I just spoke to a sheriff's officer, or actually the actual sheriff of our community, and he said it isn't even that we're losing. It's not that we're that we can't hire them. As you know, our hiring rates now have just plummeted because of defund the police and all of the civil unrest and all the people videotaping everybody and taking snapshots of information that you don't have the whole story, and it's just awful. But we can't keep people on the job. And you can't pay people enough money to make them stay in a job and do their job well. You have to give them a sense of value about their work. And so I tell the departments when I train their officers, listen, you've got to get this at the leadership level, and everyone has to be doing this stuff so that we discharge these memories after the events, so the officers can go back and do their work on the next call and they're still whole, physiologically and psychologically whole. So yes, do I think that this is going to change the way that we hire? Do I think it's the way that we're going to train them when they get in the door and how we're going to maintain them once they're on the job? 100%. And I will not stop until we get there.
Excellent. Bill Buchanan, you were next.
Yes.
Good morning, Susan. Bill Buchanan. With my background in the military and law enforcement, I've run into some remarkable people. And I just want to say that you're in that genre because, I'm just astounded at, as I say, the people I have met who have had personal and professional, his expression bumps in the road isn't even adequate. Body blows basically is what it is. And they get up, dust themselves off, and not only get their own personal affairs in order, but they go out and help other people. This is remarkable. But anyway, I just want to say that, people like you are essential. I mean, you're not really part of the government. Come to help us. You are a person who says, I'm going to do this not only for myself, get my own personal affairs in order, so that I can use that as a platform to help, other people. We're not even close. I mean, I've Breakfast Club is aware of the fact that we're trying to put together a wilderness horseback trip next year for veterans who are wounded. Get them out there and, give them an opportunity to talk. And, we're not professionals. We're veterans ourselves. We kind of know what we like to do. And then also we had the opportunity years ago, my wife and I, to go down to Palo Alto VA, which we're working with right now, to choose these veterans. So I want to just alert you to the fact that we're looking for veterans who are, wounded veterans, Purple Heart veterans, who want to go out and are able to go out into the wilderness, enjoy the benefits. It's been documented medically, the benefits of being in wilderness, that kind of stuff. Just to let you know that. But anyway, one year, the word went out that the Palo Alto VA welcomes dog owners to come on down there. So we took our 2 hunters, we have Brittany, used to call them Brittany Spaniels, down there, had a wonderful time with the vets. And for some reason, I mean, if these little guys had tape recorders, they would have gotten some great stories about the trauma these wounded vets went through. But anyway, I just want to say that, let's see, what was it? You mentioned kind of a void of research and writings on this phenomenon of organs of the first responders being affected more than normal. Did anybody fill that gap in research?
Well, I can't say that one person filled that gap. There's a lot of research being done, but it's really around the fact that when you suppress your emotions, you store it in your tissues. And one of the articles I read said anytime there's irritation or inflammation, there's an invitation for cancer. And kidney cancer is not an uncommon cancer in first responders. And it's interesting to correlate the fact that our adrenal glands rest on our kidneys, and that's when adrenaline is triggered. So that kind of a thing has a contribution to that. And there's you have to be looking more globally than just Western medicine to see what they believe as far as fear and anger and where those store in the tissues. So I do a lot of sort of unusual research from everything I can find from Eastern medicine, Western medicine, neuroscientists. It's interesting to do that. And I want to offer a quick comment here. At this center, we're going to have equine therapy. I'm a huge advocate of equine therapy. And next week, we actually have partnered with a group called First Response Canine. And don't tell anyone, but we've got puppies coming to the next seminar. So the marshals and the Capitol Police and all these law enforcement and firefighters are going to come up to our seminar. And on day 2, puppies arrive, and we let them sit on the lawn and play with puppies because it's so healing to be in nature and to be with animals.
Yeah. We went out first week in September, my mountaineering partner and I, who lives up in Roanoke Park. He's retired law enforcement. And we were going to do a scouting session for several days for this trip that we planned next year. And I told him, I said, I hadn't been on a horse since I was 16 years old. I feel a whole lot better after this trip. But anyway, we also belong to an organization called Sovereign Order of St. John of Jerusalem. And we look for opportunities to support, especially one little group that I'm in charge of that supports military veterans organization. So I want to ask you this: you're a 501c3, correct?
Yes, sir. We're a 501c3.
Okay.
I would encourage you all, if you're interested in our work, to go peek at our website.
Yeah.
Which is resiliency1st.org, and you'll see our work and the people that we serve.
Yeah. Now, if we happen to be up in the neighborhood, do you have opportunity to tour your facility?
Absolutely. Anastasia or Tony can put you in contact with me.
Okay.
We'll get you my private cell phone number. We'll let you on the property, but you may have to do some sweeping or cleaning. I can't promise you can't. You have to work when you're here.
No problem. That's what I do around the house anyway. Thanks for a great presentation, Susan.
You're welcome.
We'll be seeing you soon.
All right. Any other questions for Susan? Doug.
Susan, when I graduated from high school, I went to work in an emergency room for 9 months or so, and then I went and took cardiograms for another 4 years going to college. And I remember the day when I was in the emergency room by myself, and rescue comes in, bounces the gurney off the truck, and there is a twin girl at each end of the gurney who had died from drowning. So these kinds of cases still stay in the memory 50 years later. And so numerically, if you think of a first responder, 10 runs a day, 10 days a month, 20 years, it's a huge number of events that keep flashing in your head.
Yeah.
And I mean, I remember the day that a guy came in who had cleaned his carburetor from with gasoline in his garage, and when the fumes hit the pilot light, everything went off. Everything was burned off, but the elastic on his underwear. So you remember these kinds of cases so many years later, and I'm not in that business.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're in that business, the constant drumbeat of these kinds of things going on in your head and experience day after day after day, and they keep coming back is an awful thing. I mean, it's a huge competency burden one has to bear if you're in that business.
It is. It's a burden, and the truth is that most of the first responders don't remember their calls because they're stored so rapidly, other than the first traumatic ones. But you probably know this, that we'd get to a point where we'd run one very, very, very hard call first thing in the morning, and 24 hours later, I couldn't remember the call because the brain is just trying to remove the information to try to move on to the next thing. And like I said, every client, every patient, every person we're there to serve or protect, they don't want to know what we just left. They want to know that I'm here for you. And so you end up living your calls moment by moment by moment and just not storing them. It really hits us when we retire or we end up medically disabled, when then it's like all those memories that have been ignored start to slide back in. And so we are helping people who are brand new to the job, and we are helping people who've got 40 years. So it's a huge responsibility, but one I feel very strongly about. And thank you for the work that you did.
When my daughter was working at a bookstore called Romans in Pasadena, and she died there. Heart just simply stopped, and I called the chief paramedic on the scene. I wanted to go in and talk to him about what they were doing, because I knew what the protocol should have been. So I got the report and I went in and talked to him for a while. And he says, no one ever comes and talks to us. We just never know what goes on.
Yep.
Just left alone. And that's kind of hard. The interesting fact is I said I would get the autopsy report. And 6 months later, when I called the station to deliver the autopsy report, I didn't say who I was. I just asked if the captain was there. And the guy says, was this the Romans incident? 6 months later, that's a lot of calls, and it still flashes in the head. So,
yeah,
I mean, it's a tough job.
Yeah. Thank you, Doug. Anastasia, you have a question?
Yeah, so kind of along those lines, I keep vacillating on whether it's appropriate to, I don't know, deliver cookies or write a thank you note or something to the people that just saved my son a few weeks ago. And because I don't want to bring that up. And I just don't know, like when you have a situation where you have people who specifically save the life of someone that you love, is there an appropriate thing to do other than what we did in thanking them at the time and remaining calm, of course, and staying out of the rain, like all those things to support them and to thank them afterwards? But, is it appropriate?
Sending a card is the most appropriate thing you can do.
Okay.
If you can name the date and the time of the event, or the people that were there, that's great too. I don't want to say I discourage it, but when you show up at a firehouse with cookies, like everybody else, it can be something that triggers the conversation that they don't really want to have again. oftentimes they're focused on their work and it's a distraction from what they're doing. And unfortunately, and I hate to say this, and it's one of these things, not that I think you would ever do this, Anastasia, but this is a big problem with one of the things that we have going on is women going by the firehouses with baked goods.
Yeah, see, that's what because it's
So send a thank you card, Anastasia. Send a thank you card.
That's why I wanted to ask, because I want to do the right thing to support them. So yeah, okay, awesome. Thank you. This has been so amazing. I fully acknowledge how crazy busy you are. I mean, you're dealing with the U.S. Marshals for our entire country right now, trying to work with them on top of everything else. And you are a woman on a mission, a beautiful mission. We so appreciate the work that you're doing, the support that you're doing. And I know by you being here, we are a very, very loving, giving, and well-connected group of people who I know will be sharing about the work that you're doing and helping to support you in that. So
yeah, anybody who's interested in helping us support getting this center up and built. I mean, I am only one woman on a mission, but I am a woman on a mission. So let me know. You can reach out to me. Thank you, Anastasia, for the opportunity. Tony, for the opportunity to talk to all the folks. I don't want to belabor any more of your time. Anyone's welcome to reach out to me if they have any questions, and I'm back off to my next meeting.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. We appreciate you and what you're doing. And hopefully you'll hear from us on a field trip to go help with the Golden Gate Breakfast Club coming.
Yay! Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Phenomenal program. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So everybody is, if you want to hang around, it's almost 9 o'clock. I have to go do some work, and I'm going to, if anybody wants to be the host, I'm going to leave. And Craig, you want to be the host? Okay. So I will assign Craig the host, but I have to go to work. And again, I'm good to see you. I'll see some of you this afternoon, to celebrate with Sid and go from there.
all right, I'm going to pop off. Have a beautiful day. Bye-bye.
Hugs to you all,
Thank
special
you.
friends.
Well, that was nice.
Excellent.
Did it work? I'm trying to.
Yeah, you're here.
No,
You're there.
I assigned to Craig, I thought, and trying to, it's not letting me. So we'll see what goes on here.
Yeah. Hell, Doug, can you stick around for a minute?
Yeah.
No, I was talking to Doug.
Okay. Yeah. So let me leave.
I know you have to go.
Yeah. I'm trying here. I'm assigning to you and then assign and leave. Let's see.
I
Hopefully.
think I'm already co-host. You got me.
Yeah.
All
But
right.
let me leave.
One thing she didn't mention is her own trauma. Because
You got into it a little bit.
you've got trauma.
You said her
Right.
own trauma? Is that what you
Right,
said?
her own experiences, because you're on that many runs, statistically, you've got that same trauma.
Mhm.
Oh, I thought you were talking about that she had 5 kids. That's its own
No,
trauma.
that's a trauma itself. But,
It's
But
not-
you know, it's interesting. When I was early in my career, I was looking at going to medical school, and so I thought, well, this is a huge commitment, so I should get some exposure to it. So I went to the local hospital, which is a trauma hospital in Denver, and St. Anthony's, and I got my EMT certificate there. And so I was on the ambulances, I was in the cardiac care unit, I was in the helicopter pad, I was working in the emergency room. I absolutely loved it. I loved it. But I decided not to get into I saw other aspects of that business that I wanted to have more control over my life. So that's why I ended up in real estate. But yeah, but it was so interesting. Yeah, it was so interesting. I'm a better realtor than I'm a doctor. It would have been.
Thank God.
Count your blessings. Oh, here comes Dr. Craig.
Uh-oh.
Act like you don't know. Don't make eye contact. Doug, it's nice to see you.
it's good to be here.
Yeah. Sorry we didn't connect. I need to talk to you, just catch up. So maybe what I can do is give you a call. You have time to take a call after the meeting?
Sure.
Okay.
I remember. I'll just share with you another case I knew about where rescue went out to a mobile home park to pick a lady who had a corner or a stroke or something. And they picked her up. They got out to the truck and they had a flat tire. So everybody in the mobile home park is standing around the truck. So they cannot stop working on this dead person because of the political ramifications of, you let her die type thing. So they had to keep working until they could get another truck up there. But she was already dead when they arrived. So, they get into these weird situations which are difficult for them to deal with. And you have to figure it out on the spot. There's no training school for that one.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you have to be Johnny on the spot on a lot of those things. I remember the one incident that kind of stood out in my mind is that, I saw different kinds of things, when I was there. And, but I just remember this one guy came in really bad shape, really really terrible skull lacerations, blood everywhere. and it was like, the reason I was laughing is he was like, he bought a pair of nunchucks and he was like spinning them around like Bruce Lee. And it didn't have a good result for him. So the lesson, don't do that. So, yeah, interesting line of work that they're in. So, yeah, real estate is a much safer career choice.
Craig, how you got to your current profession. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, what a run.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna end the meeting, then Doug, I'll give you a call. How's that sound?
Okay, that's fine.
All right. Well,
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
yeah, great seeing you guys. Thanks for sticking around.
Bye, Craig.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
One of our most valuable meetings. Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.